Hey friend, welcome back to the Care Collective podcast, the space where we talk about the real, unfiltered experience of caregiving and the parts that don't always get said out loud. This is a place to feel seen, supported, and a little less alone, whether you're in the middle of caregiving, anticipating a loss, or just trying to find yourself again after everything that's changed. Because caregiving is really not about what you do, it's about what it does to you in the process, even the emotional side of things. And today's conversation is one that I know so many of you struggle with, I struggle with, because I've seen the responses that our other topics around this have had. And so today I wanted to dive even further into grief. Not just grief in general, but to talk about what it actually looks like in real life, especially for caregivers, and how to really support someone through it without saying things that will just make everyone feel worse, right? Because let's be honest, I don't think any of us were ever taught how to show up for grief. I think especially for our US listeners, we don't handle it as well in the US as some other countries do, and the traditions and the cultures that they have there, right? So today I am joined by Jane Dye, registered nurse and certified grief educator, who brings both professional experience and a personal experience that she'll get into in this conversation. And together we'll talk about what grief really is, what not to say, what actually helps, and how to navigate both loss and anticipatory grief in a way that feels human. If you've ever felt unsure of what to say to someone who's grieving, or if you're the one grieving and you feel like nobody understands, I want you to know that this episode is for you and that you do not have to go through this alone. So just to start, Jane, can you just briefly introduce yourself and we'll get everything kicked off?
Certainly. Thank you, Michaela, and I'm really excited about our conversation. So as you mentioned, I'm a registered nurse. I began my professional life by working in adult inpatient psychiatry. And in wanting to make an impact earlier in people's lived experiences, I transitioned to work in outpatient health and wellness program as a director of nursing and medical training for a national healthcare company. So we offered medically supervised behavioral programs that created greater mental and physical well-being. And then I expanded my nursing practice to becoming an independent certified holistic health coach, providing more personalized approaches for adults to create the lifestyle habits they wanted with the help, guidance, and support, along with the accountability that many search for.
Sure.
I had experienced many losses of my family and friends from early adulthood on, but it wasn't until experiencing the death of my middle son, Christopher, 3 years ago, that I saw how little people understood and rarely responded well to my grief and of others' losses as well. So, as you and I briefly touched on, we live in a grief literate world where we avoid talking about and taking care of people experiencing loss. So I chose yet again to expand my practice to become a certified grief educator. So in that role, I'm committed to providing the highest level of grief support through education, experience, and insights into the often unacknowledged rocky terrain of grief. And I completed a certificate program designed by world-renowned grief expert David Kessler, whereby I bring his unique methodology, his tools, decades of experience to help people, as you said, navigate the challenges of grief. So this has allowed me to turn my passion to purpose in helping those in grief to find meaning after loss, and I've dedicated it to Christopher's legacy. So what's important to know, which most people may be aware of, is grief can be traumatic and transformative. So loss changes everything about you
Absolutely.
and your life, right? Your daily routine, your perspective, your future, along with your connection to yourself, others, in the world. So our worst moments can be seeds for our best moments. They do have an amazing power to transform us. And when we challenge a situation that's hopeless, we are challenged, or we're challenging ourselves. And when we
Right.
do that, we can turn tragedy into an occasion for growth. However, I'm here to tell you that growth will not seem worth it in many ways.
Mm,
And there's also no need to compare our losses when we recognize that your loss is always the worst loss to you.
absolutely. No, I think that's all beautiful, and I like what you said too about using this as a path to honor your son's memory and being able to, like you said, it's not that you would ever recommend that somebody go through this, or maybe you wouldn't even say you're grateful that you had to go through that, but it still is something that is good that can come out of, those moments. So thank you for sharing all that and giving us a little bit of a, insight into why you are so passionate about it, because I think it's important to see What is it that drives people, right? But I want to take a step back for a second and even just talk about, in your experience, or if there's even a clinical definition of this, how do we actually define grief? Because I think a lot of people think about it in terms of that loss, right? Later, we're going to get
Mhm.
into the conversation about anticipatory grief. I hear
Yeah.
people talk about pet loss, job
Mhm.
loss. Like, there's so many
Mhm.
different forms of loss, right? So, kind of how, in your
Absolutely.
words, do you define grief?
Well, we grieve for who and what we love, even for who and what we hate, but we don't grieve for what
Yeah.
we're indifferent to. So grief is the evidence of your love and caring.
Mm,
And that's really proved with every tear you shed. So it's interesting to look at grief and mourning. So grief
yeah.
is what's going on in the inside. Mourning is what we do on the outside. So the internal work of grief is a process. Some people call it a journey. It doesn't have prescribed dimensions and it doesn't end on a certain date. When people are mourning, you can't judge their grief on their external behavior, like who's crying, who's
Mm,
angry, who's upset the most. So others can never really see your grief or
yeah.
judge your grief by what emotions you show or you don't show. Only you will ever know your grief.
Mm,
But it's the connection and the attachment we feel to each other, to those we love, to our friends or family or coworkers, to the home we live, as you even mentioned, the job we're engaged in, that will all reflect the pain we feel when we no longer have our loved one or the relationship or our home or the job. So that's
yeah.
what grief is. So grief is the love that doesn't exist in that space anymore, if that makes sense.
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think in some ways that concept is probably comforting to some people to think about, like, oh, this just means I loved someone a lot, or,
Absolutely.
that's a very comforting kind of sense. Or it means I cared a lot about this thing. And that's why you feel that gap there. In terms of other kind of, I really like how you're discussing too that there's no linear way for grief to manifest. There's no timeline, there's no path, there's no right or wrong. Everybody's gonna look different, right? But I know a lot of people talk about the stages of grief. Is that something you still find useful for people to use, or do you kind of have your
I
own way
do,
of
but
looking
in
at it?
particular, the framework that David Kessler uses. And
Sure,
again, you brought up the idea that it isn't linear. It isn't a timeline. I mean, you may go forward, something may trigger, you may take a step back. It is
absolutely.
helpful, I always found, to look at some frameworks to understand and be able to kind of see how other people experienced it. It's interesting because in today's world, our loved ones may be living very far away from us. We
Right.
no longer have a natural infrastructure surrounding us in the same home or even in the same area. So, grief is a side effect of having connections, attachments, and relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So, we often think we want to escape grief, but it seems what we want to escape is the pain of loss.
Mm,
So we know there's no timeline, as you mentioned, and we know there's not a cure. So, a really important concept that David shares a lot is people in grief are not broken and
mm-hmm.
we don't need to fix them. It is our natural inclination to do that, to try to, make things better, hurry things along. And there's really no right or wrong way to grieve. However, we can explore patterns and some interventions that help us through the darkest days. And that's where I think the understanding of the stages help. But it's important to know that your grief will not get smaller over
Mm,
time. You must get bigger. And
yeah.
that's what the foundations and some of the those descriptions around the stages can help.
No, and I think at the core of it, right, is that figuring out a label or a way to kind of put a name to what you're feeling is helpful. So I think that's where these different
Oh,
things,
it's
the stages
huge.
of grief, whatever, right? Like, oh yeah, I am feeling angry. That is what I'm feeling
Hmm.
right now about this, right? Being able to put a name to it is kind of the first way to be able to combat what you're feeling, because if you don't even know how you're feeling, you don't know what to do about it, right? Because you would treat, if you're feeling anxious, that's different than if you're feeling depressed, right? The way you would treat
Hmm.
all these different feelings. So I think first working on being aware of it. I won't even say that you need to perfectly be aware of all your feelings because I know that takes time
No, no,
too.
no. But you hit on a really, really, really critical point about grief and how it does have a transformative power. So you need to feel to heal.
Mm,
And the other thing that I find in working with people around grief is whether you're the griever or you're somebody who is supporting someone in
sure.
grief, is that we don't stay in what we like to call the first generation of feelings. right? Like you're talking about anxiety, you're talking about sadness and things. People want to get us out of that
Mhm.
when we're grieving. And Megan Devine wrote this book, I think that's her name, that a lot of people like. It's okay to be, it's okay not to be okay. And in the
Yeah,
beginning in grief, nobody needs to be cheered up. You are appropriately sad. Or in, as we
absolutely.
may discuss further, anticipatory, you may appropriately anxious about the idea that you're going to lose someone or something of great value to you. And not to feel that sadness and to kind of like shudder it
Mhm.
away is a mistake because you get to feel that. And when you do, you will process it,
Mm,
more so. And I'm not going to say more easily per se, but it will be there. You'll sit with it. And the people that we want the most at that point, and this is the single most important thing you can do for someone in grief, is to witness their grief.
mm,
Again, they're not broken, so you don't need to fix them. So the people who are willing to just be with you,
right,
just hear you out, let you feel those feelings,
right.
that is single-handedly one of the most important things you can do to support someone in grief.
Absolutely. This will sound like kind of a silly example, but I think it's very valid. I don't know if you've ever seen the TV show New Girl. I love that TV show and just finished watching it all the way through again for like the millionth time. Just it's funny and it's just a good, comfort show that I like to watch. In the last season, one of the main characters, his cat dies, and
Mhm.
this cat was like one of the pivotal characters of the movie or of the TV show on and off screen at different times. And it was like a year later, because of just friends traveling, they finally were having the funeral for this cat, and his wife was like, "You still have not cried over your cat dying. Like, you're going a little bit crazy here. You need to just let it out and cry." And it takes the whole episode, but he finally at the end of it like breaks down and cries and is like, "Wow, I feel so much better. I'm so glad that I acknowledge this." But that whole episode, they had a cat funeral and the whole
Mhm.
community came together. It was this big thing. But, that was their way of saying, this is hard for you.
Mhm.
If your grief is going to make you do what some might think is a silly thing to have a musical performance, and granted, this is all for entertainment, but still the principle there of let people do what's going to help them heal, right? And help them process it. Or,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And at different ages, there are different responses depending upon the impending loss or the loss that happened. With anticipatory grief, it's also known as preparatory grief. So that
right,
can help people by planning and preparing for the loss. So, like, unlike post loss grief, which is obviously the cat dying,
sure,
that involves rituals and social support. So
absolutely,
anticipatory grief unfolds in real time. So there's care being given, a decision being made. So if that cat were sick for a long time, I have a friend who had a cat who had cancer. They did all these
sure,
procedures, and it got to the point where collectively with their vet, they decided that it was better for everyone to allow this cat's life to end, to be
sure,
euthanized. So she had both sides of that experience. And, if you love your pet, it's a loss.
mm,
People like to compare losses. There's no reason. Your loss is your loss. It's significant to you. People will say to me, since I'm a bereaved parent, and, your loss was the worst loss. And for me, this loss was, but that doesn't diminish anybody else's loss, and the way they need to deal with it and their understanding and how they have to integrate it. The thing that I know for sure is that even when someone or a pet is gone, that relationship can continue. It's just in a very different way.
different, right? I kind of want to hit on another point that you've brought up throughout this as well. Just what are some things that, as you have worked with people and talked with them, or even personally in your own experience, that you feel like were things people tried to do but are not helpful? Like things that they say that are like, well, at least it could have been worse, or,
Right.
oh, you should
So
be
yeah,
moved on by
so we
now.
can start with the worst things people can say and we can move to the best. But like
Sure.
one of the worst things anybody will hear, even about a cat, is, at least she or he lived a long life.
Mm.
Like many people or pets die, young. They don't have a long lifespan. He's in a better place.
Which
If
that one is so
somebody suffer
subjective because that's making an assumption of what you believe as well.
exactly. There's a reason for everything.
Mm.
Aren't you over it yet? Hasn't it been so long? And, what probably one of the worst I've heard as a nurse is when somebody has suffered the loss of a child and they're still of childbearing age, they say something like, you can have another child still. Like
Yeah,
somehow that's a replaceable person or
right.
relationship. If you haven't had the experience of a significant loss, turning to somebody and just saying, I know how you feel. Sometimes, these are all done with good intention. Let's just put that out there.
Absolutely.
All
Yeah,
these
no, and I'm not
people
trying to,
are
like, bash
trying to
people
do
here.
something
Yeah,
helpful. The whole thing about being strong and those kinds of things. They're not really helpful for the griever. They may be helpful for the
mhm,
person who's trying to help the griever. Probably
true.
the worst thing you can do. I don't know. You can't scale any of this, but is to say somebody like, I'm here for you. Let me know what I can
Yeah,
do for you. It's like, now I have
I
the job in my grief of telling you what I need. So follow
yep,
your instinct. If you know the person who you're grieving, just do what you think you would like done, or
absolutely.
go talk to somebody and say, what, as we are doing today, what was helpful for you? I can tell you that, sending flowers is a lovely gesture, but when your house has 17 to 20
Mhm.
bouquets, you feel like it's a funeral home. And
Yeah,
it is no longer comforting. It's just a constant reminder that what you've lost can never be replaced. I had
right.
people though who sent, which I thought was wonderful, coffee and tea, and they sent some food. People bought groceries, or, just sent heartfelt messages. Still till today, I have one dear friend who on the regular, she did it every day when my son died, but it's kind of calmed a little bit after 3 years, but just sends a heart emoji. Knowing people are thinking about you, knowing you can reach out to them for whatever reason is so helpful. And you
Absolutely.
feel that connection and you know that they want to do what they can. But in many ways, that's a limited option. But being with you is always the best. And that being said, you can always, on the flip side, you can always just tell somebody, I'm so sorry for your loss. I
Mhm.
wish I had the right words. Just know I care. I don't know how you feel, but I'm here to help you in any way I can.
Right.
You can just give a hug instead of saying something if somebody's willing. I always ask permission. I'm a big hugger, so I'll say if you allow
Right.
me, I'd love to
Yeah.
give you a hug.
No, I
Just
think
be
those
with the
are
person.
all beautiful, and I think that's something that a lot of people underestimate. And I think, again, like you said, because our society is so illiterate in grief and how to navigate these situations, and I think technology in a lot of ways has made this issue worse. I'd say there's benefits from it, like being able to text
Hmm.
somebody. That's great, right? But I think people just underestimate, I can remember points in my life where I was really upset and had a friend that just sat with me while I cried and didn't even say anything, right? And there's a
Hmm.
lot of value in that, to just not feel like you're alone in that moment. I think, especially when you're feeling that weight of loss. And for some caregivers, maybe they're feeling like, I'm going to be alone. If it's a spouse that they were caring for, if it was their parents, like even your child, there's going to be that weight of feeling like, am I going to be alone now? Am I always going to feel this emptiness? So I think
Hmm.
the
And
presence of
then you could
somebody,
also, it could be about a divorce. It could just be a
absolutely,
child leaving home for college. It could be having to move out of your house. It could be job loss or change. It could be something also equally as serious as, you're losing a parent to dementia or Alzheimer's.
exactly.
People getting diagnosed with chronic illnesses, undergoing life-altering surgeries, amputations,
Absolutely.
those things. So they're all reasons for people to experience grief. And, I even had a friend who came up to me when my son died, and she said, I have a really good friend whose son died 2 years ago. And I
Mm,
still haven't reached out to her because I didn't know what to say. And I said, there are no,
right or wrong.
well, yeah, we discussed a little bit what's better and what doesn't
Sure.
help. But anything that's said in sincerity without trying to fix that person or change that circumstance. And she said, do you think after all this time I should reach out? And I said, absolutely. I
Mm,
don't think it's ever too late. I mean, it's
yeah.
always nice. I mean, a lot you will find in grief, and any of those changes that we already mentioned, that you'll see who stays and who goes. And sometimes you'll be really
Mm,
surprised. And one of those surprises is that sometimes it is easier to speak to a stranger than it is to speak with somebody who already knows you or knows the situation.
sure.
And I think that it's important to understand that there's a lot of great research around social connection through micro connection, especially in
Absolutely.
person, that can really shift somebody's emotional well-being. And that isolation and
Yeah.
loneliness is awful. And as somebody who gets lost, experiences loss, it's sometimes a real sticky wicket for people to answer the questions that people ask around the circumstance of the loss. So it's interesting when you do get support from other people, how you are able to share your story in ways that supports you, but also helps other people be able to respond to you in a way that's really helpful.
Yeah, and do you have advice to give to people that are experiencing grief in any form? And I think something I hear often is they feel like they don't know how to communicate to their friends or their family, that they just feel like, I've been watching this other TV show lately where if somebody
Mhm.
experiences a loss and they walk back into work and everyone's just staring at them like there's a, mark hanging over their head or something. You
Right,
know, how do
right.
you kind of encourage people to communicate with their friends and family of what they're going through, or try to help them understand what their needs are if they feel like I don't know how to talk to them?
Right.
What am I supposed
Well,
to say?
first of all, some of the things we mentioned already, admitting that you don't really know what to say, but you want to be there for somebody is
I mean,
honest. It's
on the
vulnerable.
opposite side, like for the person that is grieving, how do they go tell somebody, I need your support, or maybe they don't know what they need?
Well, I think the way that at least I'm going to just share from a personal experience as well as some of my clients.
Yeah.
I think that you need to seek out people, whether they be in your personal life or in a professional capacity, to
Mm,
kind of have the opportunity to have a conversation about what it is you're experiencing and doing it in a safe place.
mm,
I know that when somebody asks me the question, inevitably happens, "Oh, do you have children?" And I
right.
said, "Yes." And they said, "How many children do you have?" And I will always answer 3. "Where are they?" So I will say my oldest son lives in New York, my youngest son lives in, Seattle. "Oh, where is your middle son?" I
Mm,
said, "My middle son lived near me until he died 3 years ago." And then it depends on that person, whether they and then most people are very empathetic, and it may be an opportunity to have a conversation right there. Also, not everybody
sure.
has to witness your grief. So there are times you can just say to people, I have 3 children. And if they start asking those questions, go, I'm just right now I don't feel comfortable answering.
Right.
You can say whatever you need to say to make sure that you're okay. And I think that's
Mhm.
another thing that we tend to do. We try to externalize that experience when you're going through grief.
Right.
It's your experience. You get to have it the way, and like I said, you will find people who will just let you lead, and there are times you do want to talk about it and times that you don't.
Abs
I think that that's something that where speaking, either joining a group like Compassionate Friends is a great group for bereaved parents. Again, David Kessler offers great information on his website grief.com, where I'm a professional on there as well. So there are sources. So I do always think, yes, to your point, I think that, technology in some ways makes our experiences less personal, but you can actually find some good resources. And that's something I am always committed to doing with people, whether they choose to work with me or not, is to provide those resources because they made a big difference. In my case, I've read some really fabulous books from bereaved parent, one who was a professional that friends had given me. And I thought that was such a generous gift. A book for me is like you can pick it up and read it when you want, how much you want. You can
Absolutely.
also put it down. Where my husband was not drawn to it at all. That was
Yeah.
not his way. And I think that's really important to remember that we're all
Mhm.
going to, just like everything else in life, have
Mhm.
our own experience with it. And a line that he actually just said to me this morning when I was talking to him about something that David Kessler shares, and it was one of those lines that really has stayed with me and the people who know me, is that unsolicited advice is criticism.
Mm. Yeah.
That really hits, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it really is
That is where
that.
it's coming from.
Yeah, so I think one of the key things in all of our relationships, regardless of what we're trying to connect on without being like, obsessive about it is asking permission, be helpful. I'm really kind of stumped. I really don't know. I'm happy to be here with you. But if there's something that you think would be helpful, tell me. And if not, I mean, when I send a text message to somebody who's in grief, because I want to just see how they're doing, I will usually just send some love and tell them there is no need to respond. Like, I just wanted to let you know I'm thinking about you, that I'm here, when if you want to reach out, and I'll keep reaching out if that's something that, you know, you're okay with.
Right. No,
Does that
I
make
get.
sense? Did I answer your
Yeah, yeah,
question,
yeah.
Michaela?
And that's something that I honestly say a lot of times to people too, is I really think adding that little, like, I'll keep texting you if you want, or adding that little, like, don't feel like you have to respond, that goes a long
Mhm.
way, because I think that's the last thing anybody needs in these situations is more pressure. And they just want to
Exactly.
know that they're not going to lose friends through this process. Because I think, yeah, like, and it's okay also if your friends do change through this and you figure out that some of them are more equipped to handle the things that you're going through and some of them aren't, and maybe
Yeah,
you will get to
grief is
connect with them
very
later, you
activating.
know?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh,
Grief
you're
is
good.
very activating for a lot of people, and if you love, you will experience grief. It's just that simple. And that's why the more, through your podcast and through other conversations, the more you can normalize that conversation so people feel comfortable expressing their feelings, as you said, asking questions without feeling they're putting someone off, allowing the person who is suffering is actually optional over time. You get to decide what you're going to do with that grief. I mean, David Kessler tells a story about how when his son died, because he had lost his mother when he was only 13, and then his son died in his early adulthood. That he could have just stayed in his house, and kids could have ridden by on their bikes and said, "Oh, that's where that old guy lives. He lost his son, and he's not going to come out." And there's something that's very comforting about knowing that if you want to check out, you can. But for most of us, we have other people and other things in our lives that are really compelling us to move forward. Oftentimes, it's what we've lost, especially if it's a person, knowing that they wouldn't want for you to stay stuck in your grief. You take all the time you need. Everybody needs to
Absolutely.
do it in their own time, in their own way. And never, even as a grief educator, do I move the conversation along. In grief education, the student and teacher are one,
Mhm.
and we work together to make sure that it goes, that the griever is always in charge of the conversation. So that's
Absolutely.
something we can do when we want to support, when we are caregivers, is to know that they get to decide when, where, and how much. Now, is there something called complicated grief? Sure. But that's something that we're not going to discuss today. That's when it's gone on and it's interfered so long in someone's life that a caregiver and family may feel it's time to really make sure that there's some sort of professional help, because it's easy to get
Right.
stuck there.
No, it is. And just briefly, do you think you could hint on what some of those signs would be? And then obviously the answer there is that you should reach out to a professional or, to a
Sure.
therapist
If
or
I mean,
something.
so they changed the diagnosis, which most of us who work in grief are not really happy about. They change it from
Mm,
complicated to prolonged. So
okay.
in the diagnostic statistical manual now, if you're going to get help, they're going to call it prolonged grief. What's prolonged? I mean, I will miss my son for the rest of my life. So is that
Right.
prolonged grief? No. It's when you really can't show up to your life. When somebody won't, I mean, it sounds really simple, but we're talking a considerable amount of time. We're not even talking 6 months to a year. So we consider a year early grief. As you move into like 2, 3 years, you're
Mm,
now getting into a more mature grief. It
okay.
also depends on the circumstances of your loss. My
Sure.
loss was very traumatic. It happened through an accident. There was no preparatory period. There was no anticipatory loss, except that there was an illness that precipitated that death, but it wasn't the kind that we were anticipating. It
Right.
happened as a result of an accident associated to the illness. It's really important that you just check on people, like somebody not able to get up and do their activities of daily living,
Mm,
somebody not eating, is somebody not showering. I mean, this is early on, but if that goes on for a long time,
Sure.
people can't re-engage at all in their relationships, whether it be close relationships or even in social situations. You may see what you see in grief anyway. You can see, like some people say, if I let myself cry, I'm never going to stop.
Mm,
Biologically, that's impossible, believe it or not. There's only a certain amount of time. And it is actually very healing, as you mentioned earlier, especially in that show, that how much better
right.
that character felt after allowing that release. There are biological as well as chemical and emotional responses
Absolutely.
to tears we're not going to get into right now. But I think, when you see somebody cannot re engage in life at all, or certainly the same thing if you hear somebody talking about self-harm,
Mm,
things of that sort are big red flags.
absolutely.
And trust me, I mean, there are plenty of times with people who lose a close loved one that they do think they'd rather not be alive anymore, but they really don't show a desire to self-harm. It's just the
Mm,
desire, as we said earlier, just to escape the pain. It's not the grief they want to avoid, it's the pain that they're
sure.
feeling after loss. And that's why whether you get your support through somebody close
Mm,
to you or you work with a professional, we don't force finding meaning. But
mhm,
when you can take that pain, I mean, am I a more compassionate person now having the loss I had? Of course. For me, of course. And that's something that I feel encouraged, obviously, to share through my
mm,
work and just my personal life. So, you can find, in fact, one of the clients who just wrapped up working with me, she had lost a child 6 years before.
mm.
And it was the first time she sought help. And that is
Yeah.
something that's really interesting that I believe, and I hope I'm not quoting the information incorrectly, but the average amount of time that somebody seeks help for their grief experience is usually 5 years, which seems like a long time, but I'm in that coaching world, so that's something.
Yeah, no, and I think that's something that I was curious about or was gonna ask, just because I think that as much as we're saying, oh, it's not linear, you can't compare, I think people still do compare and they think, I should be over this by now, or why am I still stuck in this, right? And
Absolutely.
you're saying it
And
takes
that's
five
where
years sometimes before people even ask for
right.
help, you
And
know?
that's when you talk to other people and you can examine the story, the narrative of what your grief experience is, and start to see how it is developing in your life. That you can see that grief is death is random if we're talking about death in terms of loss. And that oftentimes that blame, that shame, the things that come with it is our attempt to control circumstances we can't control. And our brains would rather be in that active state than finding acceptance, which is probably the hardest
Mm,
stage of loss, is accepting
yeah,
the loss. And then, as we discuss, finding, I mean, there's not always a quote silver lining, but finding
sure.
what could that experience mean to ourselves currently in our future lives and with the people that we love, the people we work with. How do
Mm,
we, as you asked, how do we support those people?
yeah.
If somebody walks into the room and like you said, they're like, everybody just stops, as the griever, you can say, I'm here, and if somebody doesn't know what to say, you could just have a conversation starter. I mean, you can flip it on to them and just say, an important thing in grief, I think, is understanding the timeline too. The
Mm,
question, how are you, for most people in general, but in particular for grievers, is not necessarily always the best way to approach a
yeah,
conversation, you know? I mean, it improves dramatically when you say, how you doing today?
yeah,
Where you keep it to a very specific time or, tell me how things are going for you today. There are other ways to do that I think feel more authentic. Um, but as you know, I'm looking at your beautiful face right now. I mean, just a smile, a head nod, an eye
absolutely,
contact, all those things say, I'm trying here. I may not know
absolutely.
exactly what's the best thing to do, but I really do care. And I think
Yeah,
I just saw a study that said the single thing that connects people, for example, at any situation like networking, which is always so awkward and things of that sort,
sure.
is an authentic warmth that people
Mm,
can just bring and think like, well, this is awkward for everyone. And,
yeah,
and just if you don't have the icebreaker, just take a breath, walk forward, you
Right.
know?
Or, I mean, somebody I talked to recently that different set of circumstances, and I'm sure they're still experiencing grief in other formats, but, we got on a call, finally reconnected after some time, and I just said, "How are you doing?" And they were like, "Well, I'm glad that I have therapy this week." And that's how I'm doing, So I think,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know, we kind
Yeah,
of had a lot of these close conversations, and she knew that when I say, "How are you doing?" I mean, literally tell me how you're doing. I really want to
right.
know. And so I think that some of the things is finding people that when they ask that they mean that versus the people that are just
Mm.
how are you doing just means hello in passing, you know what I mean? Like someone in the
Absolutely.
grocery
You hit
store.
on such an important piece of the puzzle. And that's, who can you really trust that is willing to sit in the discomfort with you? Because that is the most valuable thing. When you know that, when you go to this person and you inquire because you really care, that they know you really care and that they know you really want to hear what's going on. You're not just saying hello. And I think that's where it can get a little confusing for people sometimes who to share their story with and not. But as I started to say about this client I just finished with, it was a revelation to her that her story could actually help other people. That was a big revelation for her. And that, when, as you said too, when she allowed herself to feel those first generation feelings and not quickly move into gratitude or quickly go on to something else because she didn't feel she had a right to still feel those feelings, they were easily resolved in that moment. That doesn't mean they're not going to come back. It just means that you will be able to live through them,
Right.
and that afterwards there will be a sense of, at least momentarily, some calm, some peace, and that you'll be
Absolutely.
able to move on with your day.
Absolutely. Another point that I'd be curious to know some of the research about, and also if you do not know the answer to this, we can skip over this topic. And this is just my own brain that loves research and has these kind of questions at times. But, looking at grief and mental health, I'd imagine that grief is going to hit harder on those that are struggler or more prone to experience anxiety or depression or,
And
other
here's the real issue. I'm glad you brought that up
yeah,
because grief in mental illness is very different than the response to grief in physical illness. So, if we're going to take mental illness into beyond anxiety to depression, it could even also be in addictive behaviors,
right.
people who, again, have addiction to substances and things of that sort. So, in mental illness, the sufferer gets blamed.
Mhm.
They're told to get over it.
Mhm.
They're told, take responsibility for your problems. They're criticized for sometimes being what people consider weak and lazy.
Right.
They're told, stop being so self indulgent.
Mhm.
And they're also told that it's a choice. So, what I know as a psychiatric nurse, and I also have family members who suffer with mental illness, that brain that is suffering mental illness can't work itself out of what it's experiencing. It absolutely
Mm.
needs help. So, if somebody's a physical illness, think about the difference. If somebody gets diagnosed with cancer or some other diabetes, whatever it may be,
Right.
they get cared for. They're told you'll be supported through it. They're told
You
ask for
break a
help.
leg, you're given X-rays, you're given the cast, and then the
Right.
crutches to walk out of there,
But they're praised for being strong and courageous. They're told it's going to be a hard road, be kind to yourself. And there's nothing you could have done to avoid this. Totally different than somebody who suffers with mental illness or addiction. And I
Right.
think that's a huge distinction because then we don't want loving care to be withheld from people because you just like grief, you can't always see somebody's mental illness, you
Absolutely.
know and we don't want that to feel like it doesn't deserve our attention or support because
Absolutely.
it absolutely does. So I'm really glad you asked that because a lot of people really have a hard time understanding that difference and have a hard
Yeah.
time showing up for it,
And
you
I
know?
think kind of where I would my brain goes as well is the fact that caregivers are already so much more prone to struggle with anxiety and depression and other mental illnesses. I imagine there's correlation between that and addiction as well too, which I'm glad to hear you bringing that up also as a mental health challenge because it seriously is more than choice can even impact you in some of these situations. And I think Where I was kind of going with it is as you're dealing with this anticipatory grief, and again, I'm not trying to say that you can fully prevent mental illness or grief or any of that. It's all going to be a natural part of life. But I do think that as you're learning to take care of yourself, that's what's going to make you in a better place, that when you inevitably have the grief of loss instead of the anticipatory grief, that's going to be a little bit easier for you to handle if your brain is already healthier from getting the help that you need to handle some of your other
Absolutely.
things,
I
right?
mean, early support is absolutely critical for a better outcome. That doesn't mean you're not gonna, have there's so much you could do, as you've already said.
You
You
can't wish
talk
the grief away, but you can
exactly.
prepare yourself once you start feeling the early stages of grief. I mean, again, you cannot fully prepare, and there's going to be situations where it happens in a blink of an eye, and you could never prepare for
Absolutely.
it,
But
you
in
know?
talking about anticipatory grief, when you know that a loss is coming, to your
Mhm.
point, it's, as you already said, name it. Say the words out loud. You can say something as simple as, I'm grieving, even though they're still here. Or it's still here. I still have, say you get fired, I still have 4 weeks, of this
Right,
job. I need to find another job.
right.
You can ask, somebody, what brings you peace right now?
Mm,
You could act, is there anything you want us to remember or carry forward? They're difficult moments, but they can be very grounding, and they can also, you can find out, like you were saying, who are the people you can depend on to be able to
absolutely.
share what they're going through and that you can share what you're going through. For a lot of people, creating small rituals are
Mhm.
helpful. Whether you light a candle at dinner or you play somebody's favorite music, you look at photos, whatever it may be. But to your point also, sharing the responsibility of care grieving
Mm,
is really important because it's rarely sustainable alone.
right,
We do need to lean on others, family, friends, support, the palliative care team, if you're actually in the system where you're getting support
absolutely.
professionally.
So yeah, that was going to be another kind of point I was going to bring up, as it pertains to anticipatory grief in particular. Is I know you mentioned, you and your husband both having to grieve, and I'm sure you've had very different ways that you've had to grieve and ways you've supported each other in different times. And how would you kind of apply this to a caregiver setting where maybe it's a parent, a sandwich generation caregiver? Maybe they are mourning their parent and they're also having to handle their children who are sad
Yeah,
about their
it's
grandparent,
a
right?
lot. It's a lot. So again, I think, sharing the responsibility where you can. One thing that's been said often is that children are often the forgotten grievers.
Mm.
And in lots of times, adults want to spare their children,
Yeah,
the pain of loss. But the problem is that if you aren't honest, at some point, it's going to show up anyway. And then there's going to be potentially distrust with that parent that they're not being honest. So the thing is, children and teenagers often sense more than we think.
mm,
While it's natural, as we were just saying, to protect them, honesty delivered gently and appropriately is more supportive than avoidance. So for
mm,
younger children, you use really clear, concrete language. Say, for
right,
example, if it's a grandmother, our body's getting very tired and we're all feeling sad because we know she may not be with us that much longer. Where for teens, you invite the dialogue. I know this is a lot. You don't have to talk about it now, but I'm always here when you want to. That was something that was important with my two other sons, even though they're adults. They grieve very differently as well.
absolutely.
And it's like how I always felt, even when they were growing up. I'm like, I hope you feel comfortable coming to me. Like you, Michaela, I'm always going to have the data. I'm going to look up, I'm
Yeah,
going to get the right angle to share, and not personalize it where it's not appropriate. Other types of expression, if people like to draw or write or even create a ritual on their own, children may not grieve in obvious ways, but they feel deeply and they really benefit from being included. I mean, some of the things that have been suggested by other grief educators I've worked with is, you can take honestly like a class before it becomes an issue to a grave site and they
mm,
can just check out the dates. And they will see mourners and they'll see that people feel sad. They can
yeah,
also walk into a funeral home and just see that this is a place where people gather. They get to be together. They get to feel whatever they feel. So there are opportunities if people are willing to
Mm.
think about these things in advance for themselves and for the people that they love, and in particular, children. But honesty is so much more helpful than avoidance.
No, I think that's a big part of it because I think it's, if you know, for example, I know I have anxiety, so it's probably why I have a tendency to bring that up quite a bit as an
Mhm.
example. But if I know that I'm anxious, and whenever I have kids, genetically speaking, they're probably also very likely to be anxious, whether it's behavioral or genetic, who knows, learned behaviors. But I can imagine being able to walk a child through, here's how you would cope. Like, let's go through a breathing exercise, right? Like, you just want them to be able to understand as many of the emotions the same way that you as a parent are going to have to rely on maybe a therapist or a grief educator to walk you through these things. You're going to have to take
If
care of your child, and I think if anything that
parents are
justifies why you
comfortable,
need help too,
yeah,
right?
if parents are comfortable, again, not trying to fix their children's feelings, like your feelings
Right.
are valid. I saw this great little video of this dad, and this child was really acting out because he was really anxious and upset. And he wanted him to take a bath, but he knew there was no direct path to the bath. And he said to him, are you, because mom was away, so you're missing mommy? And he said, yeah. Does that make you feel sad? Yes. And he said, well, I feel sad too when mommy's not here. And then
Mm,
he said, would you like to cuddle a little? And then they brought in his cuddle toy, and he just
yeah,
took the time. Wasn't going to fix it. He just let him feel what he had to feel. And he says, does cuddling
absolutely.
make you feel better? And it did. And it's just like what you were saying with breathing or whatever. Literally with a child, you don't have to say, okay, we're going to breathe in for 4 counts. We're going to exhale for, you just be near them and you regulate
Mhm,
your own breathing, and they will instinctively pick up that
absolutely.
pattern, and they'll embrace that pattern.
Or maybe you even have a teenager that would appreciate going to one of those rage rooms where you crash plates or
Absolutely, and in
something,
fact, you don't even need to go to
It's
rage room. In fact, long before
yeah.
rage rooms were popular and I was coaching, I used to say to people, "Do you have some old, like, have some old pottery or dishes or
Yeah,
something that you wanted to get rid of?" I said, "Do you have a safe space against a wall or in a garage or somewhere where you could just haul it, and not hurt your home or yourself?" And
right.
there is something to releasing that anxiety, that anger, that, those feelings. It's really important. There is
Absolutely.
some talk about, how much you engage in that, but releasing
Sure.
feelings, I think we're going to agree here, and I think most people listening will agree, is a good thing. You do need to do it within a safe environment and with people who understand what you're going through, willing to support you. But yeah, I mean, it can all be helpful. And again, it's about, and I tend not to use this word, but normalizing the
Mm,
experience to be very wide and very deep, and like not to pigeonhole it that this is the way it needs to be done,
mhm.
that we all have
Right.
a different background. And that's the one thing I do want to mention before we wrap up for
Absolutely.
sure, is that in grief and in loss, something that happens, and you kind of hinted at it a little bit with becoming a parent, is that our old wounds, they'll surface.
Mhm.
So if we're not really sure why we're getting some of the downloads and the inputs that we're getting when we're in grief, lots of times, if there's a time in life where we had loss or we didn't feel safe or we didn't feel protected, if we still have some of the parts of us still have that reaction, they will show up in grief. And that
Absolutely.
is something also that, whether it's with a trusted friend or family member or with a professional, that you can explore, you can also heal some of
Mm.
those old wounds along the way. So they will
No,
show up though, for sure.
and I appreciate you talking about that because I think, and I wish we had more time to go into all of this. Maybe we'll have to do a part two. But
We could do
is I
that.
think another really common thing that a lot of people bring up is if they had a toxic relationship with their parents or an abusive relationship and then losing them and dealing that's a level of grief, right?
Yeah,
To go
absolutely.
through
And
that
it's a different
relationship.
process. Like I said earlier, we will grieve if we love somebody. We will also grieve if we hate somebody. The only thing we don't grieve is when we're indifferent, when it really doesn't make a difference to our life. But yeah, there's a lot to process, but there is a way of taking that grief experience in a poor relationship and
Absolutely.
still being able to have it transform you in a positive way. And a
Mm,
lot of that is understanding who we are and how we handle that and what we're really responsible for and what we're not responsible for. You
absolutely.
know, changing that changing that story and understanding where we can go forward with it.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate you sharing that and all of your personal experiences as well too. So, really quick, if anybody wants to get in touch with you, what would be the best place for them to find more information about whether they could work with you or if they need advice or anything?
Thank you for asking me. The easiest way is to go to my website, which is my name. It has my middle initial though, so it's Jane K. Dye, so JaneKdye.com. I'm also on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, don't really spend a lot of time there, but you can connect with me there. All of them have buttons you can push. I offer a free initial consultation. I want somebody to have an opportunity to meet with me if we don't know each other, have a conversation, and then decide what is the best step, whether that is working for me or finding other resources that I can provide so that they get the support they need.
Yeah, no, and I think that's great and I really appreciate that you do that as well too. I think you mentioned last time we talked that if it's not a good time for them to work with somebody, that you have lots of other resources or directions to turn somebody to kind of know where they're at in their grief process and to know
Hmm.
what is a good point for them to get help or to look at more extensive help or maybe they need some other resources as well. So I think regardless of where you're at, this would be a great way to get started on your grief process if you think that you're ready to start getting help. And so yeah, I will definitely link your website and all the other information in our show notes as well so people can find that easily. But thank you so much for sharing your experience today and being able to be, I think, really truly living up to your, I don't know if it's your life mission or your just goal with doing this, of, honoring your son's memory and being able to help others.
Well, I want to bring light where there's darkness, and that doesn't mean you don't get to sit in the dark for a while because you do. It's helping people appreciate who they are and
Absolutely.
what they can eventually gain by just looking at how this impacts their life and them being able to make some meaningful choices.
Well, thank you so much.
If this episode resonated with you, I hope it reminded you of one simple thing: that you do not have to be perfect to show up in grief. You just have to be willing to be here, to continue to live life, and figure out things as you go. And if you are the one navigating grief right now, I hope that this helped you feel a little less alone throughout the process. If you'd like to connect more with Jane or learn from her work, all of her information will be linked in the show notes, or you can reach out to me personally if you need help getting in touch with her as well. And as always, if this episode meant something to you, it would mean so much to me if you could share it with someone who might need it too, or just simply leave a review on any of the platforms that you listen to the podcast on to help more caregivers find this space. So just again, another little reminder that you are doing so much better than you think, and I am so grateful that you showed up for yourself today and took care of yourself just by listening to this podcast. It was a moment of self-care. You do not have to carry this alone, and we will see you next episode.